She almost turned back at the end of the driveway. The gravel crunched under her tires, and the farmhouse at the end of it looked nothing like the photo in the listing. Smaller somehow, or maybe just more tired, the porch sagging on one side like a man leaning into a bad wind. Hazel Morrow sat with the engine running for longer than she'd admit to anyone, hands at 10 and 2, watching a barn cat pick its way across the yard like it owned every inch of the place. Maybe it did. She was 29 years old, recently unemployed, and according to her mother, making a series of choices that reflect very poorly on your upbringing. She had driven 6 hours north of Toronto, with everything she owned packed into a Subaru that had started making a sound she didn't want to think about somewhere past Barrie. And she was about to spend the next year, living on a cattle ranch in northern Ontario with a man she had met exactly once, at her great-uncle's kitchen table, over instant coffee that tasted like regret. His name was Jonas Croft. He had looked at her the way you look at weather, assessing, not particularly welcoming, trying to determine how much damage was coming. She had looked at him and thought, this is either the bravest thing I've ever done, or the most catastrophic. 14 months earlier, her great-uncle Bern had passed away and left her his ranch under one condition. Not a strange condition by the standards of a man who'd spent 60 years talking to cattle and very few humans, but a condition that had made every lawyer in the room go very quiet. Hazel would inherit Croft Creek Ranch, the land, the house, the livestock, the equipment, but only if she agreed to run it alongside the man Bern had hired 3 years prior to keep the place from falling apart. A man named Jonas Croft, who held a lease on the north pasture and had, according to Bern's handwritten addendum to the will, more sense about this land than anyone I've met in 40 years of looking. The condition was not optional. It was not symbolic. It was legal and binding, and had been drawn up by a lawyer in Sudbury who charged $300 an hour and did not blink once while reading it aloud. Hazel and Jonas would co-manage the ranch for a minimum of 12 months. After that, she could buy him out, he could walk, or they could negotiate a permanent arrangement. Bern had apparently believed that people who worked land together either learned to respect each other or learned exactly what they were made of. Either way, he seemed to have considered it useful information. What Bern had not put into the will, what no document mentioned, was that Jonas Croft hadn't exactly agreed to this arrangement either. She found that out at the kitchen table meeting when he'd looked at her across the instant coffee and said, very flatly, "I thought about refusing." "Why didn't you?" she'd asked. He'd looked out the window at the field. "Bern asked me not to." That was the whole of their first conversation. Hazel got out of the car. The barn cat watched her from the fence post but didn't run, which she took as either a good sign or total indifference. She pulled her duffel bag from the back seat and walked up the porch steps, and the door opened before she knocked. Jonas Croft was 36 years old, built the way men get when their work doesn't happen in a gym, and he looked at her with an expression she would spend months trying to decode. Not hostile, not warm, something in the middle that she couldn't name yet. "You're later than I expected," he said. "I stopped in Huntsville." "For what?" "To consider my options." He held the door open. She walked past him into a kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and she noticed immediately that someone had cleaned recently. There were still faint lines in the floor from a mop, and the dish rack by the sink was organized with a precision that suggested effort, not habit. He'd cleaned for her arrival. She didn't comment on it, but she noticed. "Your room's at the top of the stairs," he said. "Left side. Bathrooms shared. I'm up at 5, so if that's going to be a problem." "It won't be," she said, and she wasn't sure that was true, but she said it anyway. She carried her bag upstairs. The room had a window that looked out over the north pasture and a quilt on the bed that was old enough to be her grandmother's. She sat on the edge of the mattress and stared out at the field, at the sky going orange over the tree line, at the shape of a man walking the fence below without looking up at her window. 12 months, she thought. She had been a graphic designer in Toronto. She had lived with a man named Derek for 3 years and broken up with him 7 months ago when she realized she'd been grieving the relationship for months. She had a student loan, an overdue dentist appointment, and a very real suspicion that she had spent the last decade becoming very good at a life she didn't actually want. Her great-uncle Bern had apparently seen something in her that she hadn't seen in herself. She wasn't sure whether to be grateful for that or terrified. Probably both, she decided. The first weeks were careful. That's the only word for it. They were careful with each other, the way people are careful around something fragile, or something that might bite. They divided the work without discussing it much, Jonas taking the livestock and the equipment, Hazel taking the accounts and the property records, which turned out to be a disaster of folders and handwritten ledgers that no one had properly organized since approximately 2011. She found invoices stuffed into a coffee tin. She found a lease agreement from 1987 folded inside a seed catalog. She found a photograph of Bern at maybe 30 years old, standing beside a woman who must have been her great-aunt Vera, both of them squinting into the sun with the kind of happiness that looks earned. She kept the photograph on the desk. Jonas came in one afternoon while she was reorganizing the third folder of the day and stood in the doorway looking at the chaos she'd spread across the table. "It's worse than it looks," she said without turning around. Bern didn't believe in filing. Bern believed in coffee tins, apparently. She heard something that might have been a laugh, almost. More like a breath, that had nearly become one. "He used to say if he put things away properly he'd forget where they were," Jonas said. "That's not how filing works. I know, he knew too. He just didn't care." She turned around then, and he was looking at the photograph on the desk. Something moved across his face, something private and real, and then it was gone. "He was good to you," she said, not a question. Jonas looked at her directly for the first time in days. "Yeah," he said. "He was. He left." She went back to the coffee tin. The first real fight happened over the north fence. A section had been deteriorating since autumn, and Jonas wanted to repair it with a particular type of post that cost more than Hazel thought the budget could handle. She pulled the numbers. She showed him the numbers. He looked at the numbers and told her the numbers didn't account for what happened to cattle when fencing failed. "I know what happens to cattle when fencing fails," she said, which was not entirely true, but felt true in the moment. "Then you know we need the better post. We need to stay solvent through spring. We won't be solvent if we lose animals to the highway." They stood in the kitchen arguing at a volume that surprised both of them, and the barn cat, who had taken to sitting on the windowsill, jumped down and left the room with visible disdain. In the end, she authorized the better post, not because he was right, or not only because he was right, but because she'd looked at the section of fence herself the following morning and understood, standing in front of it, that she'd been arguing from a spreadsheet when she should have been arguing from the field. She told him she'd authorized the purchase when he came in for lunch. He nodded. "No, I told you so." No satisfaction visible on his face. "We should walk the south fence next week," he said. "Show you what to look for." She said yes. That was how they started working, actually working together, not in the kitchen over the spreadsheet, but out in the field with mud on their boots. Jonas pointing at things and Hazel learning the language of them. The way a post leans before it fails. The sound a water trough makes when the line is starting to freeze. The specific pattern of a cow that's about to have trouble calving. Hours for it. She'd grown up visiting this ranch in the summers of her childhood, but visiting is not the same as knowing. She was learning the difference. And somewhere in the learning, she started watching Jonas Croft. Not in the way she would have been embarrassed to admit. Or not only that. She watched the way he moved through the ranch, with a kind of authority that wasn't arrogance. The way he knew where everything was without searching. The way the animals were calm around him. She watched him stop what he was doing to help a calf that was struggling without being asked, without announcing it, without it being a thing he did for an audience. She watched him eat dinner alone at the kitchen table before she'd come downstairs, and she watched him wash his own plate and leave the kitchen exactly as he'd found it, and she started to understand that this was not performance. This was just who he was when nobody was watching. The problem, or not the problem, but the thing, was that she was watching. It was late February when she found the letter. She was going through the last of Bern's papers, a box she'd been putting off because it felt intimate in a way the ledgers hadn't, and she found a letter from Jonas dated 3 years ago, from when he'd first arrived. It wasn't addressed to her, it was addressed to Bern, a response to something, and she almost put it aside unread. But her name was in it, her name, or almost. The niece, Bern must have mentioned her. And the lines that stopped her were these. "You told me she doesn't know what she wants yet. I think you might be the only person who sees people clearly enough to say that about them, so I'll take your word for it. I just hope she figures it out before she wastes too much time on the wrong thing. Some people don't. She sat with that letter for a long time. She thought about Derek, and the apartment in Toronto, and the job she'd been doing competently but joylessly for 6 years, and the way she'd felt on the drive north. Not like she was running away, but like she was finally running towards something, even if she couldn't name what. She thought about Bern, who had apparently looked at her life from a distance and understood something about it that she hadn't. She thought about Jonas downstairs, fixing something in the kitchen, because that's what he did with quiet evenings. He fixed things. She could hear the small sounds of it. She put the letter back in the box and went downstairs and said, "Tell me how you ended up here." He looked up from the cabinet hinge he was reattaching, set the screwdriver down. "That's a long story," he said. "I've got time." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd deflect. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and told her. He'd grown up on a ranch in Manitoba, second of 4 kids, and left at 19 because the place wasn't large enough for everyone, and he was the one willing to go. He'd worked other people's land for 15 years, Saskatchewan, Alberta, a bad year in BC, and then Bern had posted an ad in a listing no one reads anymore, one of those agricultural community newsletters that still came printed on actual paper, and Jonas had answered it, mostly because he was tired and the description of the land sounded like somewhere he might be able to stop moving. "And Bern?" she asked. "Bern was exactly what the ad described," he said, "which almost never happens." She laughed, he watched her laugh, and something shifted in his face. Not the careful blankness she'd come to expect, but something underneath it, brief and unguarded. "Why did you almost refuse?" she asked. "The will, when Bern asked you to stay." He looked at the table. "Because I didn't want to resent someone who hadn't done anything to deserve it." "Did you? Resent me?" "At first," he said, and he said it without apology, which she appreciated more than a softer version of the truth would have given her. "You showed up not knowing anything and owning everything. That's a hard thing to make peace with, and now?" He looked at her. The kitchen was quiet except for the wind off the field and the small sounds of the house settling in the cold. "Now I think Bern knew exactly what he was doing," he said. She went to bed that night thinking about that sentence for a long time. March came, and with it the calving season, which Hazel learned was not a metaphor for anything, but was instead a deeply physical, exhausting, occasionally terrifying period, during which she slept in 4-hour stretches, and developed an unexpected relationship with a calf they had to pull at 2 in the morning, during a temperature that felt like the edge of the world. She named the calf Bern, which Jonas did not comment on, but which she caught him almost smiling about twice. They were not careful with each other anymore. That's what she noticed, sometime in the middle of all of it. The carefulness had dissolved without either of them deciding to dissolve it. They argued still, but differently, the way people argue when they know each other well enough to fight without worrying about the damage. They ate dinner at the same time. He told her when something was wrong with the herd before she had to ask. She stopped justifying her decisions to him and started making them and telling him afterward, and he stopped looking at her like she might be about to do something irreparable. She found herself thinking about him during the parts of the day when he wasn't there, which she tried not to examine too closely. She called her mother in late March, and her mother asked how it was going, and Hazel said, "I think I might stay past the year." And her mother was quiet for a moment before saying, very carefully, "Is that because of the ranch, or is that because of someone?" "The ranch," Hazel said. Her mother said, Hazel hung up and looked out the window at Jonas walking the fence line in the late afternoon light, and she thought, "I am not going to do this. This is not something I'm going to do." She did it anyway. It wasn't a single moment. It was accumulation. The morning she burned the oatmeal badly enough to set off the smoke detector, and he came in from outside to help her wave a dish towel at the ceiling, and they were both laughing too hard to be useful. The afternoon he found her sitting on the porch in the cold because she'd gotten off a difficult call with her mother, and he sat down beside her without asking what was wrong, which was exactly what she needed, and stayed there until she was ready to go back inside. The night a storm knocked out the power, and they sat in the kitchen with candles and the old transistor radio that had been on the shelf since Bern's time, and he told her about Manitoba in winter, and she told him about the year she'd spent backpacking the summer after her undergrad, and they stayed up until 2 in the morning talking the way she hadn't talked to someone in years. And then, early April, a morning that couldn't decide if it was winter or spring, the pasture still half frozen and the sky doing something complicated with the light. She was in the barn doing the morning check, and she turned around and he was in the doorway, and she must have had something in her face because he walked toward her and stopped a foot away and said, "Hazel," just her name, like a question. "Jonas," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "I need you to tell me if I'm wrong about this," he said. "You're not wrong," she said. He kissed her once, very carefully, the way he did everything, with a kind of attention that made you feel seen rather than looked at. And then he pulled back and searched her face for something. "Okay," he said, like she'd confirmed something he'd been working out for a long time. "Okay," she said. Outside the barn, the calf she'd named Bern made a sound that was very loud and very undignified, and they both startled and then stood there laughing in the half-frozen April morning, and Hazel thought, "There it is, there's the thing I was running toward." The problem arrived in May. His name was Craig Sutter. He was a land developer from Barrie who had apparently been circling Croft Creek for 2 years, and who had discovered, through means she could only describe as diligent and invasive, that Hazel had inherited land she'd known nothing about until recently and might therefore be persuadable. He showed up at the ranch on a Tuesday with a card, and an offer printed on paper heavy enough to feel like an argument. The number on the paper was significant. She couldn't pretend it wasn't. She brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table, and Jonas looked at it without picking it up. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to know what you think." "That's not what I asked." She looked at the number again. She thought about the apartment in Toronto. She thought about the student loan. She thought about the Subaru that still made sounds she didn't want to think about. She thought about the calf named Bern. She thought about the morning light on the north pasture. She thought about the way the kitchen smelled, and the transistor radio, and the storm and the candles. "I want to tell him no," she said. Jonas nodded, once. "Then we should be careful," he said, because Craig Sutter was not the kind of man who took no once. He'd been back twice since his initial visit by mid-May, each time with adjusted numbers, each time with a slightly different energy, more familiar, more pressuring, the mask of courtesy sliding in increments. And then he found out about Jonas and Hazel. She wasn't sure how. Someone in town, maybe. Croft Creek was 40 minutes from the nearest town of any size, and gossip in places like that tends to accumulate and travel. What she knew was that Sutter arrived the 3rd week of May with a different approach. He had discovered some ambiguity in the original lease arrangement that Bern had drawn up with Jonas. And he'd hired a lawyer who believed the ambiguity was exploitable. The argument, simplified. If Jonas's lease could be challenged, the co-management arrangement could be challenged, and if the co-management arrangement could be challenged, the inheritance condition became murky enough that Hazel's claim to the full property was less straightforward than she'd understood it to be. It was, she would later understand, not a strong legal argument, but it was a frightening one, and it arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a letter that her hands shook reading. She sat with it at the kitchen table for an hour before Jonas came in. She handed it to him. He read it. He set it down. He sat across from her and looked at her for a long moment. "He thinks if he can put enough uncertainty into this, you'll sell to make the uncertainty go away," he said. "Will it work? That depends on you." She looked at him. "Jonas, I'm not selling." Something in him that had been held very still let go. "Okay," he said, "then we fight it." The next 6 weeks were not easy. They found a lawyer in Sudbury, a woman named Patricia, who charged less than the one in Barrie and cared more about getting it right than getting it over with. And Patricia confirmed what Jonas had suspected. Sutter's legal argument had significant holes, but fighting it would cost money and time, and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from having someone try to take something that belongs to you. Hazel called her mother. Her mother, who had thought the ranch was a series of poor choices, drove up from Toronto on a Friday with a lasagna and a check and an expression on her face that Hazel had not expected. Not "I told you so," but something softer. Something like recognition. "Your father did something like this once," her mother said over dinner. Her father had died when Hazel was 12, and her mother rarely talked about him directly. Went somewhere that scared him, and stayed because it turned out to be exactly right. "I used to think it was reckless." She looked around the kitchen. "I think now it was just brave." Hazel cried a little, which she hadn't expected. Jonas, who had stepped outside to check on something, came back in and took in the scene with one glance and went very quietly to make tea, which was the right thing to do, and Hazel noticed. The legal challenge took 4 weeks to resolve, Patricia dismantling Sutter's argument piece by piece in correspondence that Hazel read every draft, and Jonas listened to her read aloud each evening. The lease ambiguity turned out to be less ambiguous than Sutter's lawyer had argued. Bern had written oddly but had also written specifically, and the specific language held. Craig Sutter did not show up again. She couldn't be certain he wouldn't, but the land was hers, theirs, and the spring was turning into summer, and the north pasture was green in a way she hadn't seen yet, and she was too busy to be afraid. On a Sunday in late June, they drove into town for the farmer's market and came home with seedlings that Jonas thought were impractical and Hazel was committed to planting anyway, and they stood in the kitchen, arguing about where to put the raised beds with the specific, comfortable energy of people who have argued productively before. And the barn cat came in through the screen door with the air of someone who had places to be. "That cat uses this house like a hotel," Jonas said. "The cat lives here," Hazel said. "The cat was here before either of us. The cat doesn't contribute. The cat provides atmosphere." He looked at her. She looked at him. The seedlings were muddy, and her boots were still by the door, and somewhere outside the calf that had been named after her, Great Uncle, was making its undignified sounds in the pasture, and the afternoon was long and gold through the windows. And Jonas crossed the kitchen and kissed her in the unhurried way of someone who had stopped being careful about this and found out it was fine. Better than fine, on the other side. "Stay," he said when he pulled back. Not asking her to stay for the year, not asking her to stay through the legal fight. She knew what he meant. "I'm staying," she said. She'd known it for months. The seedlings went in the next weekend, impractical and exactly where she'd wanted them, and the cat approved of the location with total indifference, and the sky was the specific blue that northern Ontario produces in late June like it's the only thing it knows how to do. And Hazel Morrow stood in the garden she was making out of her great-uncle's land and thought, "I was running toward this. I just didn't have the word for it yet." The word she understood now was home.